For everyone with an interest in MASH, or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 6, Episode 12 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami. Our special episode looking at the impact of the FDA's approval of semaglutide for MASH treatment in the U.S. starts now.
For the last 5 years, MASLD stakeholders, whether manufacturers, trial sites, providers, payers, patients, or investors, have turned to Surfing the MASH Tsunami to keep track of drug and device development, epidemiology, public health initiatives, and practice patterns. This week, Surfing MASH takes a deep dive into what semaglutide's approval in non-cirrhotic MASH means for SLD treatment in the U.S. Roger Green is joined by 4 highly prestigious key opinion leaders: American Association for Clinical Endocrinology, President Scott Isaacs, Global Liver Council Chair Zobair Younossi, Mayo Clinic Director of MASLD Clinical Research Manal Abdelmalek, and Summit Clinical Research Chief Academic Officer Naim Alkhouri.
This week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
To now see 2 drugs available for a huge unmet need and feel like we're making the right strides by our patients who have really had decades of no therapeutic options, short of lifestyle modification, is truly a very fulfilling landmark time in the field of hepatology.
It's pretty easy to get a GLP for patients with diabetes, and if they don't have diabetes and they just have overweight or obesity, it's only about 30% have coverage. So for that other 2/3 of patients that have obesity but not diabetes and not have coverage, some of those are going to be eligible.
There would be more decision-making and action happening in a MASH clinic. Hepatologists always said, do in the MASH clinic, you just tell them lose weight, come back. But now we have a lot to do, and we're going to have more in the near future.
So we have to think about alternative practice pathways and how to make it easy for our colleagues in primary care and endocrinology and gastroenterology to make this happen, because the potential numbers are so much larger than before.
We had Naga Chalasani on a couple of months ago talking about the article that he and his team put about their experiences with resmetirom. For a MASH patient, they were doing 45 minutes on initial interview, 30 minutes on follow-up. It's not simply a question of getting APPs, but it's a question of getting the skills that we teach people about interviewing and conversation and how to make them comfortable.
This week's sponsors for Surfing MASH include
Regeneron is a leading biotechnology company that invents, develops, and commercializes life-transforming medicines for serious diseases. Founded and led by physician scientists, their unique ability to repeatedly translate science into medicine has led to numerous approved treatments and product candidates in development, most of which were homegrown in their laboratories. They are shaping the next frontier of medicine with data-powered insights from the Regeneron Genetics Center and pioneering genetic medicine platforms, enabling them to identify innovative targets and complementary approaches to potentially treat diseases like obesity and MASH.
LiverRight and the LiverRight Scanning Network. On April 15th, 2025, LiverRight will open America's first virtual specialty clinic for liver disease, offering adults in all 50 states video appointments and helping GI practices and health systems triage and treat the swelling numbers of patients seeking MASLD and MASH testing. LiverRight offers same-week video visits and accepts insurance. For more information, contact LiverRight, that's liver, and then RIGHT at www.liverright.com.
Tawazun Health, your partner in global liver health innovation. At Tawazun Health, we specialize in providing small or large-scale access to FibroScan examinations for liver health-focused early detection, clinical trials, independent research, and collaborative projects with clinicians and FibroScan providers increasingly throughout the world. As industry-leading experts, we design and deliver high-quality FibroScan services because we know that accurate, high-quality, reliable data drives better outcomes. To learn about our sister lifestyle app, mylife365.me, click the Tawazun Health link on the Surfing MASH homepage.
Hi, this is Roger. One of my favorite podcasters, Tottenham Hotspur ITK and journalist Alistair Gold, jokes that all the important things happen whenever he goes on holiday. Well, last week while I was on holiday, the EMA approved resmetirom for use in the treatment of non-cirrhotic MASH in Europe, and the FDA approved the use of semaglutide for treatment of non-cirrhotic MASH in the U.S. A banner week for the MASH community. For European prescribers, this means they will soon have a medicine to give patients living with F2 or F3 MASH. In the U.S., it means that prescribers will have options in deciding how to treat those individual patients. In this week's special episode, I invited 4 leading KOLs and friends of the podcast, alphabetically, Manal Abdelmalek, Naim Alkhouri, Scott Isaacs, and Zobair Younossi, to join us in a far-ranging conversation considering all the ways that semaglutide approval might affect MASH treatment in the U.S. Panelists share some interesting, sometimes controversial opinions. So why don't we just get started?
In the first part of our roundtable, the group focuses on specific ways that the approval of semaglutide will affect patient treatment and pharmacotherapy in the U.S. The group notes that the largest impact may not be simply on semaglutide prescription volume, but on derivative issues like increases in provider education and enhanced market access.
So as I was saying in the introduction, this is a news week. Last week, while I was on vacation, we had back-to-back news about resmetirom being approved by the EMA, and then about semaglutide being approved by FDA for use in MASH and MASLD. We will have a discussion next week on the resmetirom EMA issue, but today we're fortunate to be joined by four of America's leading visionaries when it comes to these kinds of issues. I'm going to go in alphabetical order because that's the easiest way to do this. Manal Abdelmalek, who hasn't been with us for a while, but is a good friend of the podcast. Manal, how are you this afternoon?
Oh, wonderful. Thanks for having me back, Roger.
Delighted to have you here. And then Naim Alkhouri, who hasn't been with us for 3 weeks. How are you?
Hey, how are you, my friend? Good to be back.
Okay. And you say you're in San Antonio today.
I am, yes, at the Summit headquarters, just working with the team. And it's good to be in San Antonio. You're reminded of Stephen and his contribution. It makes me still sad a little bit, but also it's good that we can carry on and continue his legacy.
Okay, excellent point. And a shared sentiment. Scott Isaacs, how are you this afternoon?
Hi, good to see you, Scott Isaacs in Atlanta, Georgia. Glad to be here.
Finally, Zobair Younossi, who's been traveling quite a bit and tells us beforehand that he'd been in India this month, which is right up there with Phoenix and the places I don't want to be in August, but there you are. Zobair, how are you today?
I'm doing good, Roger. No, the part of India I was in was cooler than Washington, D.C. for the first week of August. So I'm glad to be back stateside.
Welcome stateside. So with that, why don't we just quickly groundbreaker, one good thing that's happened in each of our lives in the last week, and then we will dive into this important and timely topic. Brave one, go first.
I spent a week with my granddaughter, my first granddaughter. That you can't beat that with anything in the world. So that was my.
How old is your granddaughter?
She just turned 1.
Fantastic. That's great. Next. And no, you probably can't top that. I might try to tie it, but I don't think I can top it.
I probably can't top that either, but I'm just starting my last week with my daughter before she goes off to college for the first time, so I'm about to be an empty nester.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I think there's a theme here. Manal, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, you and me both, Scott. So I'm sending my firstborn off to college, but I'm not quite an empty nester. I'm a half nester just yet. But an exciting time. Bittersweet.
Yeah. Naim?
For me, it's actually the opposite. I'm spending more time with my kids. I'm back in Cleveland, Ohio now to lead the Clinical Research Institute of Ohio. Of course, I have my new summit, which is remote, so it allows me to spend more time with the kids, and they just went back to school. So it's been a good move so far, very happy, and the research team is doing well also, so everything is falling in place.
Okay, congratulations for all that. That's great. Zobair, I just took a 2-week vacation spending the first week with my first grandchild, who is now 7, and got to spend time teaching her how to jump waves in the ocean and watching her be a slightly older kid. And if you go to Cape May, it's one of the 2 places in the eastern U.S. where you can see the sun set over water, the other one being the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. And watching her eyes as the sun disappeared in the horizon, in and of itself would have been worth the price of admission, and the week was just great. So we've got 2 happy grandparents, 1 happy father, and 2 mixed bag parents. And Naim has now become a much more fuller nester. And Zobair, you and I are in various stages of being post-nesters. I think we've got all this covered. So with that, why don't we dive in? For about a year on this podcast, whenever we've talked about what's going to happen next that matters to this community, we said, well, eventually 2 things are going to happen. Europe, they're going to approve resmetirom, and then the country is going to start negotiating price. And then in the U.S. at some point, semaglutide will get approved, and we'll have 2 drugs that will be approved for MASH. Of course, they happen one day after each other, and of course, they happen while I was on vacation, because that's just kind of how my world works. What I'd like to do today is I'd like to take some time and go through it, ask each of you for what your initial impression was when you saw all this news. And then I've got 4 or 5 questions that I want to make sure we have a little bit of time to cover. But on initial impressions, Brave one, go first, and then we'll go back to specific questions.
I'll go first. And I think in the past maybe 14 months since resmetirom was approved in the United States, and now with resmetirom being approved in EU and semaglutide being approved in the United States, it is really a sort of a new era and sort of or new energy that has been sort of injected in this field that I feel is very positive for us. So our patients have more and more options, and both research and clinical side of things for MASH and for MASLD is really getting reinvigorated. It was, getting to become a bit discouraging with, repeated sort of failures of drugs in the past when we get to, advanced stages of development and then not show efficacy. So this is a good time to be in this field. And I think both for our patients and for the field, there is a lot of enthusiasm. I think we've got significant and major challenges ahead of us. So that's also exciting in some ways, but it looks like we're going in a direction with a lot of positive energy this time.
Points well made.
I can only echo what Zobair said. For those of us who have been in this drug development pipeline for almost 30 years now, this is a complete sense of fulfillment and satisfaction to now see 2 drugs available for a huge unmet need, and feel like we're making the right strides by our patients who have really had decades of no therapeutic options, short of lifestyle modification, is truly a very fulfilling landmark time in the field of hepatology.
Well put. Next.
I'll go next. I shared the same sentiments. I think these are great developments. You shared this with me, Roger, a while back. You said when you only have one FDA-approved drug, the decision is like, do we treat or do we wait? And unfortunately, with this disease, we had not luxury, but the possibility to wait and tell people to lose weight and come back and just kick the can down the road without really making an impact on their disease. We had resmetirom approved last year, but unfortunately, many providers were still deciding, do we treat, do we wait? I think when you have 2 drugs approved now, the decision is, which one am I going to use? And I think this is the right attitude that we want, now you have 2 FDA-approved medications. You need to get your patients with MASH and F2, F3, at least on one of them, and then reassess response in a year or so, and then see if you potentially need to be on 2 medications. So I think, the future is looking good. I think the pipeline is robust. We expect other approvals before the end of the decade. So it's very fulfilling. I've been in drug development a little bit less than Manal, maybe 15 years now, but still a long time. And to see the success materialize is very fulfilling, career-wise, but most importantly for our patients.
So Scott, what does it feel like from the endocrinology point of view?
Well, it's really exciting to get a new drug approval. Everybody likes that. And, I think it does a lot for the field of MASH, raising awareness, and all the exciting things that all of you all have said. But I hate to rain on the parade, but as an endocrinologist, I will have to say it makes very little difference that this is a drug that's already approved for obesity and for diabetes and for prevention of heart disease in patients with diabetes. And so the majority of our patients are already taking semaglutide for these indications. And so in practical sense, from an endocrinology world, it's not going to change very much.
Okay. We'll come back to that because I understand. I get that. And B, I have a question about it. So, Naim, it's funny you should mention that. I used to say this to marketing research clients for years, but the first time I ever said to a hepatology audience that first drug is whether and second drug is which was roughly an hour before Manal talked me out of leaving my marketing research business and consulting to you guys for the rest of my career at hashtag 2020. But yeah, and I think I've been saying something like that ever since. I agree. And the fact that the 2 drugs work so differently and have such different impacts will, I hope, encourage or enable everybody who touches the disease and knows about the options to understand a little better the complexity and the breadth of what this disease is. And Scott, the question I'm going to come back to with eventually is, I got the idea that goes, it probably isn't going to change how endocrinologists treat, but it's going to change how they think about MASLD, or do they think about MASLD? We can come back to that later. I want to kind of go through the mainstream first. I'm just planting that for a little bit later. So let me start. What do we think this is going to do to the population of patients, A, that are eligible to be treated or likely to be treated or will be treated? You can take that really whatever level you want. Zobair, let me toss that one out to you first.
I think the question that you initially asked was a little bit different than what Scott said, which is, what is it doing to the field? I think when you have a drug like this approved and another drug expanded, there is more enthusiasm. There is no doubt in my mind about that. How is it going to change our practice? I do agree with Scott that the patients that I see, they have already the risk factors to be treated with a GLP-1 receptor agonist, and semaglutide is there. So do I see that there is going to be an incredible increase in the number of patients being treated? I really don't think so, because I would say 90% of my patients, when they come to see me, because we are a referral site, meaning that they have already gone to their primary care, and primary care starts them on a GLP-1 receptor agonist for treatment of obesity or type 2 diabetes. By the time they get to me, they've already been there. Now, I have actually had patients recently. In fact, we started some patients recently because the insurance did not cover GLP-1 receptor agonist semaglutide specifically for obesity. So that patient clearly got the benefit of also having semaglutide on board. The other thing, of course, is that, I run the Global MASH Council. So I look at it from a global perspective. The EU extension or approval of resmetirom is also a big deal, because now we're allowing patients in Europe, and I'm hoping that this is going to continue, patients in Asia and Latin America and Australia, to start having options, so that not only the drugs are available only in the United States, but also outside the United States. And of course, we're starting with resmetirom because they're ahead by about a year, but I'm sure other drugs are going to come down the pike, and this is going to include the next generation of drugs or combination that will come. I do think that in the gastroenterology side of things, maybe this will allow folks who are sending their patients back to the endocrinologist or the primary care to start a GLP-1 receptor agonist to start treating themselves, especially our APPs. Although most of the gastroenterologists that I work with, their APPs have been well-versed, at least historically, in how to use the GLP-1s and semaglutide specifically. So maybe there's going to be a little bit more opportunity for folks to do this. I still think that the options of which drug to use are going to be very interesting to see, if is that going to change. But I would start in the fact that I think most of the patients who are going to be on the GLP-1, they already are on it, although it may expand a little bit. So, but the excitement is actually making this available to more practices and more, larger proportion of this world.
Any other thoughts on that?
A little bit surprised by the percentages I'm hearing about, the patients on a GLP-1. I'll share data from my own practice, and this is true in Arizona and now in Ohio, that only about 30% of diabetics we see come to us on a GLP-1. And I think this is consistent with the national data in type 2 diabetes. So you'd be surprised. We think that everyone that, qualifies for GLP-1 is getting on it, but even diabetics, still we have a long way to go. And then in our clinics, patients with obesity, with BMI criteria that will qualify for GLP-1, if they don't have type 2 diabetes, only about 10% are coming on a GLP-1. And the issue is, as Dr. Younossi mentioned, it's just hard to qualify them for the obesity indication. They get denied. And then this will be probably another way, utilizing the MASH with F2, F3 indication, to qualify them for GLP-1 that will help the liver, but also cardiovascular outcomes. Having said that, I think it's very important to know that being on a GLP-1 is not a guarantee that you're treating your MASH with significant fibrosis. Because again, many patients come to us on a GLP-1, they still have elevated liver stiffness. And sometimes I hear from primary care physicians, like, what's the point identifying MASH with fibrosis if the patient is on a GLP-1, that will take care of it. But that's absolutely not right for many patients that will continue to progress. So if you start a GLP-1, that's a good option, but then you need to monitor and see if they still have evidence of significant fibrosis. Make sure you enroll them in a clinical trial or you start them on resmetirom. So very important. And the other thing is GLP-1s, of course, we have tolerability issues. Many patients that start on a GLP-1 within a year, they're not on the GLP-1. So many nuances, but it is a big deal. I think it's going to help us grow the size of the pie for everyone, identify more patients for both semaglutide and resmetirom. I think we have a long way to go with both medications. At least in my practice, I think many patients will benefit from adding semaglutide and resmetirom.
Okay, so Scott, Manal, I see you both nodding. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. When we initially embarked on this global phase 3 study, I would admit I was the first to question whether it will really expand market access for use of GLP-1s, because the majority of our patients with MASH have an approved indication of obesity or diabetes. And the added expansion, maybe overweight patients or obese patients who are not otherwise getting insurance approval may have access now under the indication of MASH being an an option for them. I don't know about the added 10% of patients who walk around with lean MASH who might otherwise be prescribed a GLP-1 now in a competitive landscape of two medications that are approved, both resmetirom and semaglutide. And I think what we're going to start to see is a patient-centric, individualized approach to management where we can potentially get increased access through insurance for a liver-specific indication. And it will certainly, having now two medications approved, heighten awareness. We have been challenged as hepatologists to convince non-hepatology communities that this is an important enough disease to look for, risk stratify, evaluate, or even treat. But now I think there certainly will be heightened awareness in primary care and endocrinology, short of our champion endocrinologists such as Scott here and Ken Kuzi and others. Really, it hasn't penetrated. And now I think this approval will propel a penetration of interest and knowledge and initiative forward to evaluate the liver aspect of this metabolic disease.
I think those are some really great points. And I just want to sort of reiterate that point about just expanding knowledge and awareness among endocrinologists, because we are really focused on using GLP medications, but we're not always so focused on MASH. And I think that endocrinologists don't know how to diagnose F2 and F3 for the most part. So I think this gives us an opportunity to expand the education and to help to understand fibrosis staging. But I think you also bring up a good point that it opens up the access. It's pretty easy to get a GLP for patients with diabetes. And if they don't have diabetes and they just have overweight or obesity, it's only about 30% have coverage. So for that other 2/3 of patients that have obesity but not diabetes and not have coverage, some of those are going to be eligible. And so that's where the education comes into play for practitioners that are not hepatologists, learning how to diagnose stage F2 and F3 so that they can prescribe this medication. I think it's going to be really important. But I still feel the greater benefit is just the expanded awareness that we now have another drug and that all these endocrinologists and primary care doctors know a lot about. And so now it's opened their eyes to MASH.
I think maybe I can add to what everybody. I mean, it really is, and that's probably the biggest benefit of the second drug in the United States, because all boats will rise, because both companies are going to make effort to educate providers in primary care, endocrinology, gastroenterology, APPs, and all societies are going to put out statements. So this competition at the end of the day will benefit the patients, whether it's actually through raising awareness or increasing access. Because, when you have two drugs, then the insurance companies can't start denying treatment that has efficacy in multiple sort of outcomes, especially with the liver and non-liver sort of outcome of this disease. So I think this is the biggest benefit. It's that this news will help everybody. I think both companies and that are making these drugs can see, more demand, but most importantly, our patients will benefit from this overall increase in chatter about this disease and why it's important. I mean, it's not a day that I look at Instagram and I don't see, know about MASH or your risk about MASH. I mean, I've never seen, this is not a daily targeted towards physicians. It's not in LinkedIn or anything like this. This is actually general population awareness sort of programs, and it's good for the field.
Interesting to listen to you, because when I gave this talk in 2020, these were some of the things I was talking about. That it wasn't clear to me that getting past one drug was going to do that much for hepatologist prescribing, but it would do a lot for associated provider, and it would do a lot for related specialties and even primary care, because those are the people who haven't been aware or haven't really understood. So in terms of which professionals will benefit from increased education and public relations and PR and free media and all that stuff, I think all will benefit, but the ones who will benefit most will be the ones who treat a lot of patients who may have MASH and haven't really thought about it or known about it or known what to do about it, number one. Number two, I think Zobair's point is dead on. It's a lot harder for payers to turn down two drugs than it is to turn down one. And also, in the case of Sema, this is a drug that's been around for years. So they can't say, well, gee, we got to wait 6 months and see if there are safety issues here. We already know the answer to all those questions. And resmetirom's been around long enough. So a lot of the avenues that you would use to say no to a new drug you didn't want to pay for, that isn't going to work here as well. And now there are two of them. And to Scott's point, I think, Scott, I completely agree with the idea that goes, the endocrinologist will think more about MASH. Cardiologists will think more about exactly what's in the entire cluster of non-communicable metabolic disease. More primary care docs will step in faster. And frankly, health systems are going to have to figure out how to evaluate patients. Right now, patients aren't necessarily, or 2 years ago certainly, were not standardly evaluated for MASH or MASLD as part of their workups. And that will start to change, if it has, even faster than it has already, because there are more therapeutic options and more awareness. So I agree with all of you. I think the effect is less on the immediate drug sales and more on the explosion of knowledge and what that will bring. And when we get to a third drug or a third mode of action, if you will, even tirzepatide would qualify as a third mode of action by that thinking because it has GIP, then I think things start to really go crazy because complexity is the friend of patients getting better treatment early in the process of learning.
In the second part of our roundtable discussion, the group examines specific structural changes in medical practice, including new areas for educating various specialists, increased demand for scanning devices, and a growing need for non-MD providers.
You know, Roger, to follow up on what Scott said, that endocrinologists are not too comfortable staging liver disease and identifying MASH with F2, F3. Hepatologists are not comfortable prescribing GLP-1. And I think this is going to be the biggest impact from my colleagues is that, you need to get over it and you need to be comfortable prescribing a GLP-1 and managing GI side effects is, what we train to do in our fellowship in terms of managing nausea and diarrhea as GI providers. So, if primary care physicians and endocrinologists are very comfortable managing GI side effects, we should be very comfortable. So I see this as a good thing. And there was a recent letter in Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology asking hepatologists, do you think GLP-1s are beneficial in MASH? And almost everyone said, of course, they're beneficial. But then when they said, do you prescribe GLP-1? Over 90% said, no, I don't. So this is one of the gaps we need to bridge. The other gap is, we've done some studies and Zobair did many studies looking at the disease burden. I can tell you if you look at middle-aged adults in San Antonio, Texas, about 6% of them have MASH with F2, F3. This is the entire, middle-aged adult population. So the estimates in the United States, they vary a lot, but we're talking about maybe 8 to 12 million people with MASH F2, F3 that qualify for semaglutide and resmetirom. And we do believe that we know about 325,000 of them. So this is really the gap. And this is, the size of the entire pie is so big. And I really don't even think that there would be much competition between semaglutide and resmetirom. I think it's going to be synergy to grow the pie for everyone. And when I say grow the pie, is really to help our patients, not to grow the pie for the pharma industry, but actually identify more at-risk patients and prevent progression to cirrhosis and all the complications. And I think this is really the biggest enemy that we're all fighting is lack of awareness and not identifying the patients with at-risk MASH. And I think, the approval, expansion into Europe, all these new developments will help grow that pie and identify more patients.
Naim, you bring up a very good point. And in the same vein that we as gastroenterologists and hepatologists need to embrace use of GLP-1, and I am a big prescriber. I understand the prior authorization path, and I'm willing to manage the side effects, but not everyone is. I think one of the caveats that we risk is a huge uptake in GLP-1 without regard for identifying that advanced hepatic fibrosis patient. And so patients can get put on GLP-1 because they're seen to have MASLD or MASH or at risk. And all those patients with cirrhosis fall by the wayside with the thought that they're now on a GLP-1, everything's fine, and we miss the opportunity to actually screen for liver cancer, assess MELD scores over time, look for hepatic decompensation. So while there's a silver lining that we have, GLP-1s now approved, the risk is we generalize their use even more broadly at the indication that somebody has fatty liver without regard to underlying staging and assessment of cirrhosis. So we equally have to encourage primary care and endocrinologists to put the hat of a hepatologist. If we're going to prescribe GLP-1, then the converse should be, how can we empower them with the right tools and knowledge to ensure that we're not missing those patients with cirrhosis.
Manal, does that suggest that we might see increased focus on in-office scanning, transient elastography, the 2D shear wave and stuff like that?
I hope so. I hope that every stakeholder has access to the right tools, whether it's an in-office transient elastography or a referral pathway for MR elastography or easy access in a multidisciplinary care environment to a hepatologist who can size up a patient's risk. But prescribing GLP-1s in silo of understanding the underlying severity of liver disease would create a risk of missing those with well-compensated cirrhosis.
Okay, Scott's nodding because we do this on audio. I'll note that Scott is nodding. Zobair, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I just want to remind, I'm going to show my age because I've been practicing for 30-some years. And there was a time where hepatologists used to use a drug called interferon, everyday injection for a whole year that caused terrible side effects. I remember, and we were comfortable. We were okay. So I think the care pathway in hepatology and gastroenterology has changed. Obviously, the numbers are much bigger here than it was for hepatitis C, believe it or not. 4 or 5 times. If you just look at MASH, it's at least 5 times more than hepatitis C. So, but then we had systems that we created to be able to actually treat lots of patients with hepatitis C. And I was at the Cleveland Clinic at the time, and we were treating hundreds of patients. I think now with APPs, especially GI APPs, because hepatologists cannot really take on MASH by themselves. So it has to be with our colleagues in gastroenterology and then with the endocrinology and primary care, But most of these subspecialties will be there. APPs that will be learning how to actually prescribe the medication, stratify, prescribe the medication, manage the side effects, etc. I'm going back to what Manal said. I think it's really also this raising awareness is not just about treatment, but also about finding those patients who are at risk of all other complications of this disease, both liver complications. So yes, you can use a VCTI, a transient elastography or MRE if you don't have it. There is enhanced liver fibrosis test that's already FDA approved and it's available, and that's a great test. I think people have to start getting more comfortable with the guidelines and algorithms that are out there that suggest how to use these non-invasive tests. But also it will encourage us to think about this disease not just being owned by gastroenterology and hepatology, that it's going to have to be owned by all of us from endocrinology to primary care, cardiology. But to be honest with you, having, run the medicine service line here, it's very hard to actually get our colleagues in primary care to take on another disease for diabetics. I was just trying to get them to take back the patients who are stable diabetics back to their practice. Their practice is so incredibly busy that they don't have the time to really take on more. So we have to think about alternative practice pathways and how to make it easy for our colleagues in primary care and endocrinology and gastroenterology to make this happen, because the potential numbers are so much larger than before. And if you bring in more drugs, more and more NITs, you need to have sort of the knowledge that's updated, that next year you may have another mechanism, and then how you choose and which algorithm you're going to follow requires people to follow through with some sort of keeping the knowledge out there. So my hope is that we invest more and more in our frontline providers, the advanced practitioners that really can and already zoning a lot of the hepatology sort of, maybe easy practices, so that the more complicated practices could come to a hepatologist like Manal, Naim, myself, and to endocrinologists like Scott. So I think we're keeping that will be important. The manpower issue would be important to manage.
That's a fantastic point. So, hey, Naim, paint our audience a picture of what you think that might look like on a day-to-day basis from a hepatology or an APP practice out, if you would. And then, Scott, I'm going to ask you the same question coming out of a non-hepatology practice.
Before I do that, I just want to, address one question, which is probably everyone is thinking, how are you going to utilize resmetirom versus semaglutide? How does the data compare? And I just want to give you my take on this. I think efficacy-wise, when you look at the MASH resolution, fibrosis improvement on histology, we can't compare, apples to apples, because the duration of the study was 52 weeks versus 72 weeks. diabetes. And, the patient populations were not exactly the same at baseline. We had a pre-screening strategy with Maestro-NASH where patients needed to have, for example, liver stiffness above 8.5 kilopascal and a CAP score and MRI-PDFF. So we need to keep this in mind. And for me, I think fibrosis regression is probably the holy grail and the most important endpoint, at least in terms of accelerated approval. And in my mind, I think, they're pretty similar on the fibrosis endpoint. If you look at the delta from placebo, pretty much the same. We're talking about 11-12% with resmetirom versus 14.5 with semaglutide, but longer duration. So I think I just want to put that out there that both drugs are effective, they're wonderful, but there is also room for improvement and maybe combination therapy. I think in terms of weight loss, of course, we see more weight loss with semaglutide, no doubt. On A1C also, it has more efficacy. We know resmetirom is weight neutral. It doesn't affect your A1C. But if you look at LDL cholesterol, you see actually better reduction with resmetirom. So I think these are the nuances we need to become more familiar with so we can practice personalized medicine. I also want to highlight a couple points when you look at the fibrosis endpoint. So actually within Essence, if you look at the supplementary tables, they looked at lean MASH and patients with BMI less than 27 specifically, and it didn't really work on fibrosis, So of course the sample size is small, we can debate this, but I just want to put it out there that maybe for lean MASH, semaglutide will not be my first choice. And there was a little bit of a drop in terms of the response on fibrosis in the F3 population compared to F2 and then also in diabetic patients. So I think, the reason why I say all of this is, again, to highlight that a personalized approach that emphasizes long-term follow-up and knowing that we're not going to just, put someone on a GLP-1 and forget about them and they're fine. This is a key message. And this is how we manage diabetes. I mean, GLP-1 is a wonderful drug for diabetes, but, Scott doesn't start someone on GLP-1 and say, good luck to you. It's been, good knowing you. You still monitor the A1C and you monitor for all the complications. And when needed, you add medications. And this is how I envision MASH moving forward. In terms of, the day-to-day clinical stuff, I think, our APPs and providers are going to feel more empowered now. And I think there will be more pressure also from patients to be on treatment. They're not going to take the old advice like, let's do a lifestyle intervention, come back in 6 months and we'll see what happens. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing more patients that have family members that develop MASH cirrhosis. And some of them need a transplant. Some of them develop serious complications. These are the patients that are, most motivated in my clinic to be on treatment. They see the writing on the wall. There is a genetic component to it. And I think, the knowledge is spreading among patients. We have many wonderful patient advocates also that are raising awareness. My take on this is there will be more decision-making and action happening in a MASH clinic. Hepatologists, historically speaking, they always said, this is boring. What do you guys do in the MASH clinic? You just tell them lose weight, come back. But now we have a lot to do and we're going to have more in the near future.
Listening to you raise an interesting question. One of the things I've been in the back of my head as I've been listening to all of you is most hepatologists started on transplant, and transplant is kind of a heroic thing. You take somebody who's very sick and you really turn their life around very quickly. This is different. Is hepatology the right specialty to be thinking about what to do with early stage MASH patients? And if so, is that going to be the doctor, the APP, or are they going to wind up in multi-specialty metabolic practices of some kind? How might that work?
I think hepatology is a great place, irrespective of what stage a patient is in. The issue for all of us is capacity. Do we have the capacity to see every patient with MASLD and MASH, and particularly those with very mild disease? We really don't. And so where I could be of more service is for that patient who needs liver-directed pharmacotherapies specifically for at-risk MASH, or care because they have cirrhosis at potentially the expense of enriching a hepatology clinic with those that are closer to a liver-related outcome than those that are much farther removed from it. And so I think if we had, ample amounts of hepatologists, sure, we'd be happy to see any patient with liver disease, but it's a matter of capacity. And I think the same issue resonates for endocrinology and even for primary care. And so we're going to have very creative and innovative care strategies strategies. We need to train more advanced practice providers. We need to train potentially more physicians with a dedicated interest in metabolic diseases and their multi-system complications. I don't know what the right answer or right approach is now, but at least for the time being, many of us in hepatology clinics are wanting to see that at-risk MASH or patient with more advanced liver disease. I can let Naim and Zobair speak for themselves, but I would say it's a matter of capacity.
You know, I want to be provocative here, Manal, and say it's not a matter of capacity, it's a matter of the business model. If there was actually a financial incentive for doctors to take on more MASH patients and it was lucrative for the practice, I promise you that we will find the resources. The problem has been is that, you know, there is no money to be made in an outpatient hepatology practice. GI practices survive on doing screening colonoscopies and procedures, and seeing patients in clinic is becoming less and less and less lucrative in the United States, because if there is money to be made, you will create the resources around it. And this is the sad reality. And I want to be provocative here because, this will actually advance the field and save lives. But how can we develop this outpatient hepatology business model that makes money? Because I promise you that there's many entrepreneurial people in the United States and there's many resources to be leveraged. But this is a question we struggle with on a daily basis. I can tell you, having worked in 3 outpatient hepatology practices, what saves us is really clinical trials and clinical research. There are practices that survive on endoscopy still, or a relationship with the transplant program where you get subsidized by the transplant program. This is really disheartening that again, seeing patients in the United States now is just not a viable business model by itself, and that's the sad reality.
I agree with you, Naim, but it is not actually unique to hepatology. That's the pay sort of model that we have in this country, where the E&M sort of specialties, whether it's hepatology or from primary care or endocrinology, they're not getting paid the same as, and that requires a fundamental change in how we actually change the payment structure in this country, whether it's actually pay for performance or whatever it is that we structure. It is huge, a huge challenge, obviously, because if we have the model of care, then we will have enough primary care physicians that can actually have the time to see another patient. So I think that's a really important issue, but it is going to take at least another decade or more to really resolve this manpower issue in medicine in general. What I do think that's going to happen is that I want to make a point to your listeners, Roger. It's important to raise awareness about MASLD. It's important to say 38% of the general population have MASLD. And I've done a lot of this research myself. But it's also important to say that not all MASLD patients will develop. In fact, the majority of MASLD patients will not develop liver disease. It's only the small proportion of patients that have MASH. So it's important to know that, or to emphasize that those patients that have MASH are at risk for bad liver disease, so that we and this is where our technology can help us. I actually think that the power of AI and the power of sort of machine learning to help with risk stratification, so that this is not automatically, if we have systems in place in 5 years where your patient with MASLD are, immediately and efficiently identified and risk stratified, and only those patients who are really at risk with the current NITs or the new NITs, so that your accuracy for identifying a patient at risk is close to 100%, that you get those patients to the front line, and whatever that front line is. That's where we need actually more and more. That's going to be our challenge. Payment for providers will be a challenge, but the way I see technology going outside medicine, this is for our field of hepatology, this is going to be one of the biggest opportunities that we have to leverage the sort of machine learning and AI sort of technology to really enhance the risk stratification strategy, so out of this big pile of hay, we can find that small needle of a patient that's actually at risk. So we don't exaggerate the risk, but at the same time, we don't sort of diminish the risk and find really the patient that needs the care. And then we will have enough providers that probably could actually take care of this if we have sort of this level of APPs, all the subspecialties, with transplant hepatology being really at the top, where I would submit to you that the transplant hepatology is such a busy work for a lot of us that you really want to see the patient that needs you because they have a year or less to live, and you want to focus everything you have, you would want to share the rest of your patients with more, with earlier disease, with F2s or F3s, with your colleagues that have more time.
And in the third and final part of our roundtable discussion, the group answers Roger's question about what will look different 1 year from now. In the process, panelists look at what will be different in 5 years, as well as some of the less obvious challenges the healthcare system must address to screen, diagnose, and treat MASH and MASLD with appropriate focus, given how much of the population lives with some form of steatotic liver disease.
First of all, in a recent episode, we had Tim Jobson from Predictive Health Intelligence in the UK on. And in Somerset region in England, just using data in NHS, they were able to identify a significant number of patients who were clearly at high risk of liver disease who weren't being seen or treated or identified that way. And of those that primary care actually called and said, we think there may be an issue here, you might want to come in, something like 2/3 of them actually showed up. So I think that speaks to your point that goes, if we can find efficient ways to identify people, they'll be responsive. What NHS has that we don't have in this country is a relatively low-cost way of getting all those patients accessed. So I think that going back to what we've been talking about, the cost model is going to have to drive down the cost of getting patients treated, whether that's by APPs or AI or both, or combinations of technologies we haven't even thought of yet. Given how many patients we're talking about, the cost is going to have to get down to get MASLD evaluated. But that if we can do that, I think patients will be responsive. I can't see why patients in the U.S. would be meaningfully less responsive than they were in the U.K., for example.
No, I agree. I think there will be, the compliance and adherence issues will always be an issue. That's the reality of practice of medicine. But I think what UK and places like Sweden and other places, Scandinavia has, they have been pioneers in terms of, sort of having access to data. Because in order to risk stratify a patient, you need data and electronic data that's not just, my institution and that institution. There are national databases that they have access to so that the individual can actually get risk stratified easily. So people are working on that in this country, and I'm hoping that that's going to be but it is you have these sort of risk stratification models included in the electronic medical record of institutions, but they're probably foreign. And there are not too many of them right now, and it certainly is not at a national level. I think this is going to be something that we could benefit from, the advance in technology in this specific field of liver disease with MASLD.
So Scott, what will and won't change in endocrinology as a result of all this, do you think?
Well, first of all, I just want to comment on what Zobair said. I think you make some really good points, and with the numbers that we're seeing, really the only way to expand this is going to be involving primary care, and not only involving primary care, using the technology, like you said, so that people can be screened efficiently, but also just making it part of the routine guidelines, just like we screen our patients with diabetes for diabetic kidney disease. They need to be screened, and we need to be starting with very simple tests like the FIB4 that everybody can do. And then, of course, we want people to have access for elastography and more advanced tests, but just getting that basic universal screening for high-risk patients, I think, is really, we haven't gotten there yet, and we need to be moving more in that direction. I think when it comes to endocrinology, what I'm seeing is just an increased awareness of MASLD. 5 years ago, I think most people didn't really know much about it. They just knew simply just fat in the liver, and I think a lot of people didn't even realize the association with diabetes or metabolic disease. But as time has progressed over the last several years, especially with the approval of resmetirom and now with semaglutide, it's bringing this awareness into the forefront of of doctors, of endocrinologists, and of primary care. And now they're seeing these patients with mildly elevated liver enzymes, and they're not being ignored as much. I see more endocrinologists that are purchasing elastography machines to use in their offices. And also, I say the same with bariatric medicine. A lot of them now are getting in the machine because not only does it help them with screening patients, but it also helps with the bottom line. You talk about E&M and having trouble surviving, but when they have an extra revenue source in the office, like doing elastography, it incentivizes them both from the patient care perspective, but also from the financial perspective. So it's difficult for them to make the investment, but if they can do it, it's really, I think, beneficial from all those aspects. So seeing this increased awareness, seeing increased screening, and now with more drugs and increased treatment, I think the future is really promising for MASLD and endocrinology.
So what happens next year, right? I mean, we're talking about lots of things, all of which are going to happen over time, but I'm not smart enough to do this, but people who are really good at this figure out, okay, what are the next 3 things that are going to happen? And by that, I don't just mean more drugs. I mean, a lot of things are going on at once, right? We've got issues around drugs. We've got issues around screening. We've got issues around who treats. Where do you expect to see the next couple of cracks or breaks, if you will, towards better treatment? Where should people be looking?
I mean, I think with these new developments, hepatologists are going to use more GLP-1s, which is a good thing. I think also endocrinologists are going to start thinking about MASLD and MASH in their patients on a GLP-1 and realizing that, this is not the answer to all MASLD and MASH, and that many of these patients will probably benefit from resmetirom or clinical trials. And I think the size of the pie is going to grow because now we have more awareness, more companies behind educating about this disease. We see some commercials, as Dr. Younossi said, on Facebook and Instagram and places you don't expect to see advertisement about MASH, which I think is also good. So these will be the 3 things I see changing, at least in the near future.
I see that we're going to do a deeper dive into some refinement on our approach, too, as we figure out which pharmacotherapy is the best alignment with a patient's disease or clinical phenotype. GLP-1, there are no GLP-1 receptors in the liver, and to get a therapeutic response maybe with a patient who is not as insulin resistant, maybe leaner, or have F3 fibrosis may require a combination or approach that we're using both anti-metabolic therapies and liver-directed pharmacotherapies in combination. And we got to understand, which drug to start with, A, B, or combination approaches. And there's probably going to be more refinement in doing this. And there's certainly going to be more interest on third-party payers, especially if we're going to be using 2 therapies for one indication. They're going to want to know more answers.
I think if I can add to what Manal and Naim and Scott said, is that we probably will see 3 things. But, resmetirom has been around for over a year. Has it taken off? Yes. Are we there optimally? Not at all. I think there are plenty of patients that should be treated that were not treated right now. So I think we still have opportunity to educate not only primary care endocrinology and but also gastroenterologists who, believe it or not, sometimes they're not really paying attention to this disease as much as they should. So I think with the 2 companies now being involved here, and all societies, both in GI and hepatology as well as endocrinology, getting more and more involved, and guidelines and guidance and algorithms to raise awareness, I think we'll see more awareness, I'm hoping. Second, I think we need to get better implementation of algorithm within ITs that we already have, where it's actually starting with a FIB port and going to transelastropathy or an ALT test, or develop new ones. I think you see movement in that direction so that you get better refinement of these in IT algorithms with, the next, hopefully, couple of years. And third, of course, is to really expand the care pathway so that as you get these new drugs come in, you develop sort of a care pathway that would put the patient with the right provider. I really don't care who that provider is, as long as that provider is willing and is capable of providing the care. Knowing the manpower issue in medicine in the United States and even in Europe, I certainly foresee that, yes, we would expand to primary care and endocrinology and others, but I think the biggest expansion that needs to happen, and folks are actually quite eager to do it, is in the APPs, because they are eager to actually specialize in this area because they know the potential. I don't see the number of GI and hepatology fellowships go up immediately. I don't really see, somehow opening in our primary care physicians' offices and increase by 10-20%. So I don't really see that. I only see the 2 solutions is to leverage the technology, to use it with the algorithms that we have, and really expand our APP pool right now. But anything else we do outside this, whether it's endocrinology endocrinology or primary care or anybody else, I think, more power to them. Bring them in under the same umbrella, because hepatology alone is not going to be able to deal with this disease.
So one thought I have is this. We had Naga Chalasani on a couple of months ago talking about the article that he and his team put in, I think it was CGH, I could be wrong on the publication, about their experiences with resmetirom. And one of the comments he made was that for a MASH patient, they were doing 45 minutes on initial interview, 30 minutes on follow-up. I suspect that it's not simply a question of getting APPs, but it's a question of getting the skills that we teach people about interviewing and conversation and how to make them comfortable. That's going to take, the training is going to have to take a kick in that direction as well. If we really want to be maximally efficient at getting and effective at getting people to talk about exactly what their situations are and what they need to do to control them.
But it's very important to understand that especially the initial management is just not to say, okay, well, you have a FIB4 of this and you haven't, I'm going to do a transglycerol and that's your number. There are other things that we want to do to manage these patients' totality of their issues, which means, talking about lifestyle, especially alcohol. I mean, how to actually assess alcohol consumption, these patients are going to be critical moving forward, both in clinical practice as well as in clinical research. But so it does take a bit of time. It does take training, once and the follow-ups are the same. So I think you need to not only sort of teach our providers or APPs or other how to sort of decide on whether the patient qualifies for treatment or not for either liver-directed or metabolic treatment, but also all these other things that we were not doing very well in the past. It's because we don't have the time to do it. Maybe that's an opportunity to really sort of manage this in sort of a metabolic clinic concept, as Scott was talking about, so that people know that if they have diabetes, if they get their annual eye exams done for diabetic retinopathy, or their kidneys checked, that they're going to have their liver checked. But then you still have to manage their at least pay attention that they're being followed by somebody for their potential kidney or eye or potential for neuropathy and other things. And that is probably much more complicated than a hepatitis C patient that I used to treat in some ways.
Okay, Scott, thoughts, comments, and what it means specifically. I think Zobair's point about metabolic practices and how that might take shape.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a paradigm shift to start looking at liver disease on the same level as neuropathy and retinopathy and nephropathy. But that's exactly what we're trying to do. And with diabetes guidelines and algorithms and recommendations, MASLD screening, I mean, I am involved in efforts to try to get that right up there on equal footing with other complications of diabetes. And if we can do that in an efficient way so that it becomes part of the everyday practice of practitioners who treat patients with diabetes, then I think that's going to go a long way, because it has to be integrated into everyday practice. There's just not enough time, as everyone's saying, there's just not enough practitioners to make this something totally separate. So if we make this part of the everyday practice, I think it's going to do a lot.
Okay. Closing question. If we were having this conversation a year from now, what's the one most important thing that will have changed in the U.S. in the next year about treatment of the disease, either as a result of these approvals and the increasing attention or anything else that's going to happen?
I think in a year, I'll be hopeful that there'll be more awareness about this disease in general. I don't think that we're going to do anything else in terms of bringing new drugs. Maybe we'll be more comfortable in using one drug or combining two drugs. Maybe we'll be more comfortable in using more and more NITs, maybe two NITs that now we're going at this sort of an algorithm that we find ways to actually combine and get better clarity. So in a year, that's where I think we will have more off. I don't think that there's going to be any earth-shattering changes in a year with new treatment. But what we have, I'm hoping that will be used better and more frequently in an appropriate setting, so that we can treat more patients, not only in the United States, but across the globe.
Okay, next thought. What's one thing that's different in a year?
In a year, we will have had almost 30 months of post-approval for resmetirom. So we are going to have a better handle on our real-world experience with a liver-directed pharmacotherapy for NASH, and whether we start to see a shift in burden. We'll have better understanding of health economics. We'll have better understanding of utilization and comfort, and the outcomes of the increased awareness awareness and education. And I think we will have opportunities for add-on therapies. And maybe even at that point, we'll get readouts for other ongoing clinical trials that we will be able to see a landscape and paradigm of combination therapy starting to emerge. But I think 2.5 years of post-approval of resmetirom is going to further increase our knowledge of whether we're making an impact or not in this disease burden.
Naim or Scott? One thing we'll see in a year that matters most.
Yeah, I think, in a year we talked about, more providers being comfortable prescribing GLP-1 and resmetirom and increased awareness. But here are my predictions in 5 years, because I think so much is going to happen in 5 years, not much in 1 year. In 5 years, I think liver biopsy will be completely out in terms of designing clinical trials. I think NITs will become available in primary care settings. I do believe that we will have probably 4 or 5 options to choose from by then with different mechanisms of action. And I do believe that we will have at least one FDA-approved treatment for MASH cirrhosis. So although 1 year, not much in terms of the pipeline, 5 years, I think are going to be transformational, and the entire field is going to look completely different by 2030.
Fantastic. As my people say, from your mouth to God's ears. Scott, go ahead.
Well, I think that you all have said some very thoughtful things about the future, and I agree that in 1 year, we may not see a lot as far as new drugs, but I do think that the main change we're going to see in a year is knowledge and education, and it's already starting, as I mentioned, with the primary care providers and with endocrinology, and we're a little bit still behind the hepatologists, but where I really see the education and knowledge increasing is with the public, with the general population, because now that we have this very popular drug that's been approved, people know about semaglutide, people use it and talk about it, it's all over social media, people get the compounded version, they do whatever they can to get this drug. So now that the word is out that this drug is now available for steatotic liver disease, there's going to be a whole bunch of people saying, hey, what is steatotic liver disease? Hey, do I have this? And so I think people are going to be asking their doctors to be tested, and if they have it, they're going to be asking their doctors specifically for the medication. So that's the change that I see over the next year.
It's interesting you say that. One of the clients I work with brought in some sales professionals who had no medical background to speak of, who 3 weeks in were running and getting themselves tested because this was just a new idea, right? And they got the whole thing, right? Like, gee, if I'm pre-diabetic, does that mean I need to be more worried about this? It was interesting looking because, we live with people who know about this, right? We all do. So watching intelligent, informed, successful people who came out of a completely different paradigm in life look at this disease for the first time, it becomes like the old med school phenomenon about if you learn about it, you get it. But that's been happening here. And I couldn't agree with you more, Scott, that as we see more education and more publicity, that people are going to become more knowledgeable. Now, sadly, because this is how the world works, some of them will get bad knowledge, but many will actually get knowledge that they can use and act on and take to the right places. And then it's going to be a question of, can we get enough frontline treaters at a price point that makes sense that folks can actually get treatment? And that probably will take more than a year. But I think I think you're right, the pressure from the consumers will be massive. You folks have been fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. And here's Roger with the business report.
Slava Ukraini, Froyam Slava. While the Western democracies stand firmly behind Ukraine and Trump vacillates and temporizes somewhat, let's hope all this diplomatic activity will bring an end to the fighting with a solution that recognizes the right of the Ukrainian people to live in peace and pursue prosperity once again within their borders.
We're still planning for Paris.
I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but repetition never hurts. I'll be in Paris for Paris Match, arriving on September 9th, leaving on the 13th. Please let me know if you'd like to catch up to learn more about the podcast and how we're doing, chat about a topic that interests you, or simply reconnect on a personal level. Looking forward to it.
Welcome back, Magic Mike.
The magnificent Magic Mike Wilson has returned from France with a love and appreciation for the people and the diversity of the country. Also, he has returned with renewed passion for MASLD and the podcast. Glad to have you back, Guy.
Our first ratings report in a long while.
Through the end of 2023, we provided more or less weekly updates on our ratings and the pod status charts. I don't intend to get into weekly rating reports again, but I will probably provide summaries once a month or so. Within the last month, we've been in the top 10 medical category in Spain and the top 100 health and fitness category in Brazil. Over the month, we charted in 13 countries in the medical category, 2 in the much tougher health and fitness category. And some of the interesting medical chart countries included the UK, Canada, India, Denmark, Spain, Japan. I think that's enough for now. Thanks.
And And that wraps up Season 6, Episode 12 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami. On behalf of the surfers, our guests, and our sponsors, Regeneron, Liver Right, and Tahwazin Health, thanks for joining us this week.
Please join us again next week. Depending on the schedules of our European KOL friends, we will either post a special episode discussing the impact of the EMA resmetirom approval, or return to our regular discussion on key events from the first half of 2025, coupled with newsmaker and expert interviews. You'll just have to listen in to hear which path we chose.
And until then, stay safe, surf on, and we'll see you next week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami podcast. Bye-bye now.